The Gormans were especially sensitive to the incident with the bulls because of the losses they'd already suffered. Out of a herd of 80 cattle, they lost 14 head prior to the arrival of NIDS. Some disappeared, others were sliced up. 12 more cows and calves were killed while NIDS was on the ranch. Their neighbors, the Garcias, lost several animals as well. Some of their cattle appeared to have been killed by being dropped onto the pasture from a great height. The cattle mutilation mystery has been reported in at least 15 states dating back to the 1960s. Thousands of animals have been sliced up with surgical precision, mostly under the cover of darkness. If humans are doing it, not a single suspect has ever been caught. For the Gormans, the livestock losses were devastating, both financially and psychologically. And then things got worse. On March 10, 1997, Tom Gorman and his wife walked out of their home and into the pasture, planning to tag the ears of several calves that had been born in the preceding days. It was a bright, clear morning. Snow was on the ground. 50 yards from their house, they found the first calf.
They were with their dog. The two of them tagged and weighed this animal. They checked it at, I believe it was 84 pounds or 87 pounds. And they left the animal there with the mother. Everything seemed to be fine, although they did detect an odor in the air around this area. They detected a strong musk smell. They took note of it, and then they headed west, and they went about 300 yards west beyond the dog run was not there at the time, but about 300 yards beyond, towards where that incline is. And they were tagging a second animal.
Only 30 to 40 minutes had passed. The Gormans had an unobstructed view of everything in the field, but didn't see or hear anything unusual until their dog focused its attention back toward the house and the first calf.
The dog with them down here at this stage began to act really strangely. It started growling, the hair on the back of its neck went up, and it started facing back towards here, growling and snarling, and then it just took off west, away from this spot. It just took off. It was never seen again.
The Gormans were curious and walked back across the field.
First thing they saw was the mother of the animal was running back and forth, kind of in a sort of half circle, from about this area to the fence line, just running back and forth, and it was limping. I mean, it was dragging its foot. It was limping. They met the animal and they noticed that it was just totally out of breath. It was panting. It was obviously in deep stress, and it was dragging one leg.
And then they noticed the calf, or what was left of it.
Spread-eagled on the ground, just about here. It was lying with all four limbs just spread on the ground. All of its internal body cavity was gone. It was completely, pretty well, all of its muscle was gone from the torso. The legs were still intact, but one of the ears was also gone. So they called NIDS.
The rancher placed a call to the NIDS investigators who'd returned to Las Vegas for a rare weekend off. Within a few hours, a 4-man team, including a veterinarian, was on the scene.
Necropsy started, and the first thing that the veterinarian noticed during the necropsy was that the ear of the animal had been sliced off with a very sharp instrument, possibly a scalpel, and the ear had contained a very large plastic yellow tag, like an ear tag that they had just put on, and it was gone. So the necropsy proceeded. About 10 feet away from the animal, there was a femur. One of the femurs had been forcibly ripped out of a ball and socket joint, which is extremely difficult to do, I mean, in terms of strength. It looked initially, superficially, like a massive predator had just lain waste to this animal, removed, 60 pounds of meat in 45 minutes, which we don't know of any predator that could have done that.
And how could a predator inflict such carnage without being seen or heard by the rancher, his wife, or his dog, who were a few hundred yards away in the same field on what was a quiet Sunday morning? No four-legged predator known to science could do it. The team gathered tissue and bone samples, which were sent to 3 independent pathology labs. The results arrived later, but confirmed what seemed obvious in the pasture that day. The calf had been carved up by someone wielding sharp, metallic instruments. A heavy machete-like object had slammed into the bones. A smaller scalpel-like knife had sliced the hide and muscle.
But closer inspection revealed that it was definitely sharp instruments used. There was no sign of blood. There was no sign of entrails around. It was perfectly clean. Not a drop of blood on the grass. We went even as far as doing an experiment by pouring blood on the grass to see how fast it would seep through. Videotaped the grass and showed, even 2 days later, you could still see the stain on the grass. So there was no blood whatsoever, not a single drop, either underneath the animal, on the animal, or on the grass. It was just completely clean.
A professional tracker was brought in. He scoured every inch of ground in and around the field, looking for tracks, human, animal, or vehicle. Nothing. Eventually, the investigators reached an unsettling conclusion.
The bottom line is this animal must have been killed elsewhere because there was no blood. There was no blood on the scene, and then the animal must have been brought back, laid down carefully, almost, really almost ritually on the spot where it had been tagged.
The NIDS team investigated dozens of mutilation cases across the country. Many of the tissue samples were analyzed in NIDS' own lab in Las Vegas and then double-checked by independent labs they hired. The Utah calf was in a category all its own. It seemed akin to psychological warfare, intended to shock and frighten the witnesses. The following night, there was another scare in the darkness of the first homestead. Shots were fired at something that had rattled the herd. Eventually, Colm Kelleher surmised that the perpetrators responsible for the calf were mechanical, like an assembly line in a meatpacking plant. A machine was involved with this carnage.
Whatever happened to that calf was an extraordinarily skillful job.
Mutilations are clearly one aspect we can put our finger on, that we can quantify to a degree. Physical evidence remains after the event, and we grasp to it in search of answers. Who is performing these horrific acts of violence? Are they meant to unsettle us? Why? And are there even answers to be found in these questions? During the time of the NIDS investigations, the phenomenon recorded and documented was more than elusive. It never actually repeated itself. From creatures to craft, from disembodied voices to trickster-like paranormal activity, it was a cosmic game of cat and mouse. Dark, shadowy beings observed climbing out of orange, glowing geometric portholes. Silent craft carving out chunks of tree branches as they traversed the landscape. Geomagnetic anomalies sending compasses into tailspins. Events indicating a precognitive ability by the phenomenon to know the next move of the investigators. This area has been described as a paranormal Disneyland. If it's weird, it's happened in the Uinta Basin. But by far, the most constant theme in the area has always remained focused on UFOs. Ships that appear without discrimination. But not just passive UFO sightings. Sightings that are participatory. Experiences that tend to communicate with observers, interact with them. It's been happening in the area since humans settled there, and it continues to this day.
My God.